What happens when a husband says, "We've just talked about it and I've made the decision. It's your job to submit"? Woohoo! Fun times. A lot of us have been taught that that's the end of the disagreement. No more discussion. That the husband's final decision is what God intended for marriage. Does leadership always give a husband automatic veto power over his wife? Or has her submission been separated from his character and responsibility level? That's the distinction we're going to look at today. Hi there, I'm Lillian, and this is Shrewd Wife Life. If you've followed every piece of Christian marriage advice out there, 5 years of it, 10 years of it, and things haven't improved, here's what I want you to know before we go any further. It's not that you haven't prayed enough, forgiven enough, or worked hard enough. It's that the advice you've been following was never created for the kind of marriage you're in. On this channel, we look at marriage the way Scripture actually describes it, instead of forcing every marriage into the same Christian formula. Let's get started. Submission has been elevated to the be-all and end-all of Christian marriage. Like a wife's submission is more important than her relationship with God and her sanctification. This is a problem. There's a clear tension between the camp who advocates for literal total submission and wives who have been severely damaged by the spiritual gaslighting that's got to happen in order to convince a wife to stay in a surrendered posture in a dangerous marriage. For those of you new to this channel, that was me. There's been a complete misunderstanding of submission because it's taught as if it's an outcome of male authority. The husband always gets the final decision rather than a response to a husband who's taking responsibility. Does a husband sometimes make the final decision? Yes. But owning the final responsibility isn't the same thing as possessing the privilege of automatic veto power simply because he's got the title of husband. The truth is that any decision-making authority that any person has is only equal to the weight of responsibility that they're willing to bear before God. And logically, if a husband and wife discuss and they make a decision and they're in agreement, there's no competing direction that calls for submission because they are already in alignment. Submission only becomes visible when their opinions are different. And that's why so much teaching about submission has concentrated almost entirely on disagreement. And what that's done is turn submission into a single purpose. It's become the husband's conflict-ending trump card. Submission doesn't exist statically or in a vacuum without context, like most of us have been taught. A wife can't follow or align herself with what her husband isn't taking responsibility for. What we need to be able to do is to distinguish submission that's divinely ordained from compliance that's toxic. Understanding the difference between the two is what protects the spiritual well-being of the both of you without abandoning God's design. When I say toxic compliance, what I mean is that somehow a lot of wives have come to believe that submission to a husband and obedience to God are the same thing. And what makes it so powerful is the fear of what will happen if she doesn't comply. And that fear makes her adapt to her husband's behavior, even if her conscience is being violated or if she's got to surrender her feeling of safety, lose her identity, or even cooperate with or enable sin. She does that by adapting because she believes that she's got to keep the peace and prove that she's a submissive wife. But here's the thing. God never asks a wife, one of his daughters, to submit to sin or abuse. There's a difference between a husband being dead wrong and a husband being abusive. A husband can be seriously wrong in his leadership without using abuse to get his wife to cooperate. But that's what's going to happen in a dangerous marriage. It will always always contains some form of deception, whether it's lying, manipulation and gaslighting, or coercion. Those are the levers that a husband pulls to get his wife to override her own truth. So she feels pressured to comply, like she's honoring God and her marriage if she submits. The teaching that tells a wife that she's got to always submit becomes toxic because it's taught as a blanket statement instead of requiring real-life context. Divine submission doesn't work without context. Toxic compliance does. Let's look at an example. Imagine your husband saying, "I've decided we're going to use our savings to buy new furniture." You ask, how much will be left? What's going to happen if an emergency comes up? This is a decision that affects both of us and maybe even the whole house. And he responds with, "You wanted me to lead more in the finances, but now it looks like you don't trust me after all." Just because a wife asks questions doesn't mean she's refusing to submit, and it doesn't mean she's being contentious or nagging either. She's asking for context now because she's going to have to carry the consequences of a decision that she didn't make. Godly leadership isn't demonstrated by having the last word or making an announcement. It's demonstrated by taking complete responsibility for the direction you're heading in. It's taking everyone who will be affected into consideration and being transparent enough so that all family members want to freely follow. Toxic compliance thinks that submission is a result of authority instead of a wife's response to responsible leadership. Something I used to hear all the time was that, of course, a wife doesn't have to participate in her husband's sin. That's true, but it became a cliche, like that one statement should provide all the living context a wife needs. But that ignores a deeper problem. Wives already know they don't have to commit obvious sin. The deeper problem is what happens when she's been taught that questioning him or resisting him or refusing to cooperate with him is itself sinful. In reality, then, her compliance is not voluntary, it's coerced. And coerced compliance will shelter what he's doing wrong. It will remove the resistance that would probably expose it, and it's going to help him avoid the responsibility and the consequences that God wants him to experience. That doesn't mean a wife makes him sin or that she's responsible for it. It means that the teaching she's listening to has trained her to comply, and that compliance is now functioning like insulation around his sin. The very voice that is supposed to reveal his sin to him has been shut down. And that's the opposite of what a helper is. The Ezer Kenegdo is a mirror in front of her husband that reflects himself back to him. If her voice is silenced, the husband is essentially left without his rescue ally, which is a tragedy for him. If the word helper has always felt small or subservient to you, I highly recommend watching my 2-part series, I Am Not a Helper, where we deconstruct that myth and look at the true, powerful Hebrew meaning of Ezer. And once you understand that foundation, you can check out my video titled Sexless Marriage, Why He Blames You, and you'll be able to see how that mirror is meant to function as a rescue in a marriage, and what happens instead when it's blamed or distorted. Those videos will be linked for you at the end of this video. Submission is a voluntary alignment with God's order, but that alignment doesn't mean a wife places herself underneath a man's veto power. It's not as simple as alignment under a man, which is what the English translators kind of make it sound like. It's far more nuanced. Alignment isn't merely under the man. It's alignment with his own direction and actions toward God. The concept of submission is better understood through alignment and balancing than through the phrase hierarchical structure. I used to use that term in the past, but I don't like it because marriage roles aren't really static. I mean, the structure exists, but the people within it are living and moving. Life is continually happening and decisions are always being made. And there's a trajectory that's always moving. It's either heading up or down. Alignment and balancing have that movement built right into them. Leadership and submission work together for alignment. The husband aligns himself with God, and the wife's submission reflects and responds to that alignment. The Greek word hupotasso means to align yourself under someone or something. Submission can't exist in a vacuum because it's not stagnant. It's not a parking spot. It's movement that follows in a particular direction. And that means we've got to ask some questions like, where is the movement going to take us? If I align with this direction and follow, will it take me toward God? This is why a wife's observation is an integral part of divine submission. She's not being asked to close her eyes and follow the title, husband, because then she won't be able to see which direction his life is already moving in. How does he steward himself? How does he steward his body, his time, his money, his responsibilities, and everything else that God has entrusted to him? Has he made himself dependent on God in that stewardship? Or is he leading from the authority he believes belongs to him personally? There is so much freedom within divine submission because a wife can observe if a man's leadership is becoming more like shepherding because of his dependence on God. His ego cannot be the source of the direction because the authority he represents doesn't belong to him. This kind of observation feels like judgment because it is an act of judgment, or more accurately, discernment. As the Azer, she was created to see him clearly, to recognize the direction in which he's moving, and to reflect the truth of what she sees back to him. If his leadership is dependent on God, the stewardship of his life, self-discipline and self-control, will be visible. That visible stewardship gives his family a reason to trust the directions he's taking. But if a husband can't even lead himself toward God, he's not going to be able to lead anyone else. The title of husband, it doesn't prove that he can lead. His stewardship does. Then, when divine leadership is actually being provided, a wife has something real that she can align with. But what happens when there's no leadership? Nothing being provided, no example of leadership for her to observe. Then the command to follow or submit or align becomes moot. Trying to follow someone who is spiritually or relationally immobile is nonsensical. God doesn't ask a wife ever to pretend that an announcement or a demand or a personal preference has magically become leadership just because a man said it. A wife can't align with a direction that doesn't exist. Your submission is always to God first. If your husband's direction leads you away from Christ-like character, spiritual integrity, or safety, you've got to stay submitted to God. This matters because every thought, decision, every action will move you either closer to God or further away. When Paul wrote to wives, he used qualifying constructions that required them to discern the direction that their husbands were leading in. Now, depending on your existing view of submission, that's going to determine how you interpret both of these phrases. The first qualifier is from Ephesians 5. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And then in Colossians 3, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. There are two possible ways these qualifying phrases are commonly interpreted. The first one is interpreted to mean that submission to the husband equals obedience to God. With this interpretation, a wife's submission to her husband is treated as equal to or interchangeable with her submission to God. It becomes toxic because the husband is effectively requiring his wife to submit to him with the same gravity that she submits to God. And if a husband demands that, he's making himself equal with God. He's grooming his wife to de-center God in her life and put him in that spot. Should a wife submit to a definition of submission that requires her to treat her husband as God? No. I mean, obviously, when you frame it that way, no, she shouldn't. Well, this understanding has been shaped in part by the political theology of the world that gave us the King James translation. It was a world ruled by a king who believed his authority came directly from God, and that resistance to the king was resistance to God's established order. James strongly objected to the Geneva Bible's margin notes because some of them challenged the authority of kings and church rulers. So he authorized a new translation to exclude that commentary. It doesn't prove that King James personally dictated the wording of every marriage passage or deliberately ordered the translators to subordinate wives. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the translation was created within a political and ecclesiastical culture that treated hierarchy, obedience, and male authority as part of the established order. And that framework still influences the way verses on marriage get interpreted today, especially when the English wording is treated like it's inherently benevolent, while the underlying Greek and its qualifying constructions are completely ignored. The second interpretation sees those phrases as if they are more like caution signs from God. He chooses to protect his daughters, and he does that by weaving the call to discern right into the verses. Grammatically, both verses have been constructed to function adverbially. That means they qualify the previous phrase. They're adding modification to the governing standard of the wife's submission. Paul's not elevating a husband's power to God's level, and he's not making God and the husband interchangeable. In Ephesians 5:22, Paul writes, as to the Lord. The word hos functions as an adverb of manner or comparison, as, in the manner of, or with reference to. The husband isn't being called the Lord. It's the Lord, not the husband, who sets the standard for what her submission should look like. In the Greek text of Ephesians 5:22, there is no verb for submit. The action is carried forward from verse 21. So you can see the way Paul built the sentence. He's instructing wives to not let submission stand alone in a vacuum. He keeps it connected to the preceding Christ-centered context. Colossians 3:18 is even more direct. The verb aniko carries a sense of what is fitting or appropriate, and encurio, in the Lord, puts that fitness and appropriateness within her relationship and allegiance to God. These phrases aren't arbitrary additions to a would-be unlimited command. They're defining the manner and scope of submission. Paul simply refuses to let a husband level himself up to be equal with God. The grammatical framework he set up here opens the space for her discernment. She's got to be able to determine whether or not the submission being asked of her is consistent with her prior and higher allegiance to God. This interpretation lines up with her feminine purpose as an Azer Kenegdo that goes all the way back to Genesis, which is where her true identity and discernment come from. Those phrases make it possible for her to determine what she can submit to and what she can't. At the center of this whole conversation is identity in God and personal stewardship. Sadly, most of what's passed off as biblical submission is nothing more than a wife being expected to cater to opinions and preferences and the ego of a man. That's not divine submission. A husband having a preference or announcing a decision isn't leadership. Any teaching on submission that requires a wife to prove its sin or comply is asking her to surrender her conscience, and that doesn't please God. That makes obvious sin, like breaking the law, the only legitimate reason for a wife to not submit. But she is responsible for way more than just not breaking the laws of the land. She's responsible for stewarding her conscience, her integrity, and her obedience to God. The question isn't, can I prove it's sin or illegal? The question is, can I follow this direction and still be faithful with everything that God has entrusted to me? If you sense that submitting to your husband's leadership is going to put your own stewardship out of alignment with God, that's what matters. And sister, you don't always have to be able to explain the angst right away. Maybe you don't have words for what you're seeing. Maybe you can't trace every piece just yet. That's okay. It's enough to recognize that you don't have peace about it. You can take ownership of what you're sensing without letting someone else rename it like it's rebellion or contentiousness or a failure to submit. And yes, you might even call it wrong. You're allowed to be wrong. Imagine that. A wife isn't required to surrender her God-given discernment because she might have read the room wrong. We all do this. We all make mistakes. That's part of our human journey. Thank you for sticking with me to the end. I hope this video brought you a sense of clarity and freedom. Remember, your discernment is a gift, not a rebellion. If this perspective on stewardship and conscience resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How are you learning to distinguish between toxic compliance and divine alignment in your own life? I know how heavy this is, and if you're not ready to share what resonated with you, that's okay. Just leave a heart in the comments and let me know you're here and that you're leaning on God's discernment today, and it helps me know who to pray for. If you're ready to dive deeper into your identity as that rescue ally, those videos that we talked about are on the screen right now. I'll see you over there or in the next one. God bless you.